All right, we're now being recorded. This is Tuesday Bible Chat for September the 1st, first day of September. And I've entitled the topic tonight, Law Enforcement. And I put an article up on the Realm that people could look at. If you haven't looked at it, you might just want to download it and skim it. It's a PDF. It's an article out of Christianity Today. And I'm going to review it very quickly. Then we're going to look at the scriptures and then hopefully have a good conversation about policing in the United States and in Austin, and what the Bible has to say about it, and what kind of a theology we should walk in, perhaps based on what the New Testament teaches us. So let me offer a prayer, and then I'll begin the review. And Father in heaven, we're grateful to be gathered together. I pray that you would guide our conversation again. Lord, we've had many interesting and sometimes at moments difficult conversations together. So I'm grateful for this crew that continues to gather. Tonight I pray that you would help us to help one another to see things maybe from different perspectives and to trust you in a more practical way with these matters at hand. In Jesus' name, amen. So the lead articles in the Christianity Today for September 2020 were all about policing. So I put that in my note on the Realm. So the one that I put up there, which I don't even remember the author's name. He's a professor at Wheaton College, professor of New Testament at Wheaton College. He is also himself a black man, and he's written a book about his view of things, his experiences. What else do I need to say about him? Oh, and he's also an ordained Anglican priest. So he's a guy, I think, that has substance behind his words, and I think it's good for us to think about what he has to say, because he doesn't condemn, which I think is well done. He doesn't condemn policing in general. He does speak against inappropriate policing, and he describes some of that. So let me begin by discussing that. Hey, Tommy Mack, everybody. He's Tommy McIntosh. Hey, good to have you,
expert.
Yeah, I told him I want him to come because he's a pro.
Yeah.
So, no, he is. Tommy, I know you think every time I say something, I'm a yank in your chain, but it's just not true. Oh, and by the way, brother Tommy, just want you to know we are being recorded, so you got to behave yourself. I can't hear you. Are you muted?
You have to.
You're muted, Tommy. You gonna stay muted? We don't want you to be muted.
Yeah.
Okay. Would somebody, Jim? Would you look up the article and tell me the man's name whom I'm fixing to quote here? Appreciate it. Okay, in this article in Christianity Today, the man talks about an incident where he was unjustly pulled over, at least from his perspective, unjustly pulled over. And so he called it driving while black. He's in a gasoline station and surrounded by 3 black SUVs. And he was just there to get gasoline. And it frightened him. And he said that he'd been pulled over more than a handful of times for no good reason, and police officers might push back against that, because officers often have reasons they don't tell the people why they're being pulled over. They're not required to, as far as I know. So it's only a courtesy on their part. Anyway, so driving while black, and so there's a question that comes up in my mind that we can discuss in terms of developing our own theology of policing, which is what he encourages us to do. And that is, there's Esau McCaulley. Thank you for that. Esau McCaulley is the name of the brother who wrote the article. So are we comfortable giving police officers the discretion and the power to halt citizens for questioning and maybe a little bit more than questioning, maybe other actions that may end up frightening our citizens? Do we feel comfortable giving that power to individuals who are extensions of the state. So that's one thought, one question. Okay, so it goes on to say that from his perspective, for a long time, Black Americans have been, this is a quote, under the knee in the U.S. He's referring to George Floyd being pinned down on his neck. Is there a responsibility? Do we have a responsibility as followers of Christ to understand Christian ethics in application of policing? In other words, is there something that we should think about as followers of Christ with regard to how police officers who represent us conduct their affairs in policing the citizens of the state? Okay, so I think these are really important questions, good questions. Then he appeals in the beginning to Romans 13, 1 through 7. So we've actually looked at this text before, but I'm going to read it again right here at this point. Romans 13, everyone must submit himself. This is the NIV, as my Black pastor friends say. This is the nearly inspired version, the NIV, nearly inspired version. Anyway, so I'll leave that as it is. Everyone must I can't go on. This still cracks me up. That's because they were all using the authorized version, and made me understand that they were using the authorized version, while using the nearly inspired. For those that don't understand what I just said, the authorized version is the King James version.
The one Jesus used, right?
Paul walked on.
Right.
Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. For he is God's servant to you. He is God's servant to do you good. That's a really important phrase. We'll come back to that. To do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. So there's there was a point in his article where he said people are not worried about this text because it's unclear. It gives most people pause that study it because it is so absolutely clear. It's absolutely clear. It's black and white, and it causes people to go, really? There's no nuance in here. There's no speaking truth to power. There's no place for conscientious objection to the state. There's no place for civil disobedience. This is a black and white statement, and so our author is saying we need to be careful about how we handle this text, because if we're not careful, then we give a power to the state that should only belong to God. We can't afford to make the state divine. And so he goes on a little bit later to point out something that's really critical, and that is there's a presupposition behind this text that the state is doing what is right. The power of the state is being used for good and not for evil. So that's a really important thing.
Yeah. Oh, and I think that's really clear in the text too. That's.
Go ahead.
I think that carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer implies that God is granting a specific scope of authority to the state for what is right and wrong. But when the state steps beyond that and is no longer serving the wrongdoer or doing good, then it's not acting in God's authority.
It's good.
It's acting in its own.
So maybe another way to understand the presupposition is that the state only has authority as it, as you said, walks in righteousness. If the state's acting in righteousness, that's when it has authority. And the one that determines what is right and wrong is not the state. And there's a wiki stick it right there. That's where followers of Christ and believers in the Bible can oftentimes get in trouble with the state when they as a prophet point a finger back at the state and say, do what is right, do what is right, do what is morally accurate. And then there's the arguments about that. Okay. So then he looks at, which I thought was interesting, at Romans 9, 9:17. Romans 9:17. He says the text in Romans 13, which gives the authority to the government to punish evildoers, and says that when we're not in submission to the state, we're disobeying God also. He says, but you have to remember that Paul, that's not the only time Paul talks about the state or authority. Romans 9:17, for the scripture says to Pharaoh, I raised you up for this very purpose, that I might display my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. He goes on from there. Therefore God has mercy on whom he will have mercy. And he makes the point that God punished Pharaoh because he was wicked in how he treated his people, how he treated the Israelites. And he used a human agent, Moses, to push back against the authority of the state and to call the leader or the state to do what was right. And the presupposition behind what is right and wrong is that God is always in the right. And sometimes, even maybe most of the time, the state is in the right, but only when it's doing what God wants done. But when the state opposes God, then the state must be confronted, and God uses agents, us, to confront the state. So he does judge wicked kings. Okay, what else did you say? All right. So then one more text I think is really good. It's one that I've I thought of here on multiple occasions, but I thought would be a good one to look at tonight. Luke chapter 3, verses 4 through 6, and this is where you would get some of John the Baptist preaching. The dude was a fireball. He was really something. You know, you brood of vipers, you bunch of snakes. All the crowds that are coming at him, you bunch of snakes. Who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Let's see. I'm in verse 4. I must have copied it down wrong. Okay, here it is. In Luke chapter 3, so that was at verse 7. You brutish vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? And then, what shall we do? The crowd asked. John answered, the man with 2 tunics should share with him who has 1. The tax collectors came and said, what must we do? And he said, don't collect more than you should. So John is speaking truth to various groups. And then it gets to soldiers. Some soldiers came to him, asked him, what should we do? This verse 14. He replied, don't extort money. Don't accuse people falsely. Be content with your pay. And the thing that this particular teacher did, Esau McCauley, which I thought is accurate, but it's really a good insight, is he said in the Roman Empire, there were no local police. The police functions of the state were carried out by the Roman soldiers, particularly in the occupied territories. So the occupied territories were not allowed to have local police with policing authorities. Only the Roman, those powers were held onto by the Roman government and executed by the local police officers. So this is a local soldier. So here's basically a word to police officers. Don't extort money. Don't accuse people falsely, right? Don't extort money. Don't accuse people falsely. And the accusing people falsely can easily be applied in the realm of policing, or understood in the realm of policing, pulling over people without a proper reason for doing that, doing searches and seizures inappropriately. We have, and of course, our Constitution speaks against that. Threatening people. In the case of our teacher, pulling over young black kids because they fit a certain profile, who are in terror and making them afraid because these guys have guns. So, one thing, so I'm almost done here. So one thing he did that I liked a lot was he talked about the difference between black Christians in America and white Christians in America and their experience, and how he used the illustration of Martin Luther King being in Birmingham jail, and then there were 8 prominent white pastors speaking to him and saying, "Hey, don't be bringing your agitators into our part of the world. You're in here creating havoc and raising and causing trouble." And then Martin Luther King has this famous response, a letter from a Birmingham jail. And in part of his response, he says, "I'm here because there is still injustice. And I'm here speaking as a prophet to power structures that are continuing to allow and support injustice among the people that I serve." And basically, he advised, "Why don't you join me in pushing back against injustice, because the state is wrong in how they're treating our people." So that's my way of saying what he did. And then this guy Esau McCaulley ends his writing, which I appreciated, by saying, he said, "You may wonder what I'm looking for." He says, "I'm looking for living free from fear. I don't want to be afraid of being stopped by police officers and not understanding their intention." And in his illustration at the beginning, he asked the police, "Why are you doing this to us? Why are you doing this?" And they never gave him an answer, which I think was probably not right. I want to live free from fear. And like a lot of black people that I've talked to, he made note of the fact that he didn't want his kids to be mistreated or perhaps injured by the police when they're not doing anything wrong. So I think that's not a bad way to understand a certain state of affairs in American law enforcement. That's certainly not the whole story. And you may say, well, that's a pretty prejudiced or crooked story. But whatever illustrations we use, I think my goal here tonight in talking about law enforcement is to help us develop a biblical theology that's applied to policing, it's applied to law enforcement in our day and time. So let me open the floor by saying, whether if you read the piece, that's fine, you can comment on it. Or if you just want to comment on some of the things that I brought up, things that I said, let's do that. Let's do that here initially, then we'll begin to raise some questions and discuss those, okay? Anybody have some comments? It's okay to be inflammatory. It's all right. We're all friends here, and we're being recorded, so.
Gee. Well, I'll start off. I really liked the article. I thought he wrote in a very understanding way. It wasn't one-sided concerning the scripture. And one of the things I was thinking about was that how easy it is sometimes to have this legalistic view on something out of scripture and mandate it and not step back and ask, well, you know, what we're submitting to, is it even correct? Are they even biblical? And I appreciate that questioning the authority is not ungodly, you know, and rebelling maybe, but questioning and understanding things.
That's good.
Yeah.
So for the record, this brother, Tommy McIntosh, he's from Alabama. And he's spent much of his adult career serving as a head chaplain for the Travis County Sheriff's Deputy. So he's He's a deputy dog on top of being from Alabama. And he's a theologian.
I don't know about that last part.
He's a
I grew up
preacher, at least. A preacher.
Yeah, there we go.
All right.
I grew up in all of that integration
All
time.
right.
And my elementary school was the first classroom to be integrated. Dwight and Floyd Armstrong, Graymont Elementary in Birmingham, Alabama. And the fear that took place in their lives during that time. But what we've observed at the police, the cops, the deputies that I've talked to, I think one of the things and we're implementing a leadership of character, that the issue has a lot to do with the character of those in authority and the character of the police officer. So a lot of times, this is just my take, the inappropriate action on the field is just a common aspect of their whole life.
Okay.
Lacking character, that kind of thing. So it's not, now maybe there are some cases, I think, that maybe they overreacted out of fear.
That's a lot, yeah.
Yeah, and who knows. But anyhow, I think character of leadership, character of those in authority really is the heart of a lot of this problem, that we look at.
So you're saying, at least in these days, and with your experience there at the Sheriff's Department, it's not so much an institutional issue as it is the character of some officers who have lived their lives without much virtue, and now their policing has not an adequate amount of virtue in it. Did I understand you correctly?
Yeah, I think that's one of the major issues. Yeah, and so I what is it like to be a black man? What is it like to be a police officer in the middle of the night? I mean, how are you going to react and how are you going to feel? And the other thing, and then I'll hush. I think the other thing that has diminished a lot of things is that we're a country that you're not guilty until you go before your jurors, the peers. And what complicates these things now is it doesn't matter whether you are the perpetrator or the policeman. There's instant judgment by the media.
I got it. So I want to add one thing to what Tommy said. The guy who wrote the article said that John the Baptist was calling the soldiers not to heroic deeds, but to heroic virtue. I thought that was really good insight, heroic virtue. Hey, somebody else. Tommy and I can talk this entire 90 minutes, I promise you. There's Moses. I didn't.
So early on, you asked a question that I've been thinking about, and that was, should policing exist? And when I think about that, in my mind, policing exists as an entity so that I don't have to do that myself.
Okay.
But I was thinking about, especially when you were talking about right policing, policing with integrity and with virtue. I know we elect our sheriffs, but we don't elect the deputies. They're hired by the sheriff. So it's an extension of when we elect somebody that we think will have this virtue we're looking for, and we rely on him to then hire deputies that also have that virtue. And I'm not so sure about police departments. I don't think we elect police chiefs. I think they're hired by city councils or whatever, which ultimately should be, elected based on virtue that we want to see in our leaders. But I think sometimes that trickle down doesn't happen as well as we would like. And that while we might hire a sheriff with virtue, or we elect a sheriff with virtue, his choice of who he gets to hire, and his ability to see into their character is flawed. And I think we end up with some bad apples. And unfortunately, as Tommy was saying, that they get instantly judged in the media, and that judgment extends to the entire force, not just the one
Yeah, that's a good.
who did something that was questionable. I do know, because I've interacted with a lot of law enforcement officers, mostly sheriff's deputies out in the county here. A lot of them go to work afraid, and they're typically alpha dogs, and so the way they deal with that fear is to want to remain in control, and so therefore the way they deal with people, they're going to be authoritative and confrontive, because that keeps them in control in a situation where they're in doubt. And I think that's just horribly unfortunate, that it's got to be that way. And maybe it doesn't have to be that way, but it seems to be that's the way it is.
Yeah, I don't know, but I can't speak to the sheriff's department, but in the Austin Police Department, they train their officers to take control of the situation. That's part of their training. So the only way for them to be safe and to guarantee the safety of others is for them to be in control. So whenever I rode out with a police officer, the question was always, when do I get out of the car? And they basically say, well, when I've obtained control of the situation, then you can get out of the car. So they're trained to be aware of that. But to go to work in fear is really difficult. And I for one think the atmosphere of our nation today creates a significant amount of anxiety for our police officers. I think it's here in Austin for sure, and other places. So let's go back to this question that Jerry Moses Latham brought up. Should policing exist? Or maybe we should ask the question, not so much should it, but why? If so, why should it? Why should policing exist? What are the reasons for the police? You gonna get to us, Bill?
Here we go.
Here we go.
It seemed like in the 1600s in the small villages, they had the night watchman. And that was the first type of policeman, and he would walk through the village every hour, and he would check all the doors to make sure they're locked. And then he would call out on every hour, 6 o'clock or whatever, and all is well or whatever. And then if he actually came across nefarious activity going on, then he would ring a bell and yell, and everybody had to jump out of bed and come help him, apprehend whatever was happening, and that was and then they would take turns being the night watchman, I guess. And then they ran into problems where people would pay the night watchman to be on the other side of town, looking at something else while something else was going on that they shouldn't have known about. And so that kind of things kind of happened too. But the thing that to me that makes me not want to be a police officer is that everything's videoed and everybody is your critic.
That's a different world today, isn't it?
Everybody's an armchair quarterback. They all know more than you do. And whatever reaction you come up with, it doesn't matter what it would be, they would know better than you did what should have been done. And then it's all over the news, and the whole community is just determined that you blew it when they didn't even know the whole context of the situation. So that's
tough, isn't it? Yeah. Hey, I need to make a note here, Jerry, that from now on, there's a video proof that Andrew mowed your grass today on September the 1st. I've been watching him mow the grass for about 20 minutes back there. It's awesome.
Get that man a riding mower, man.
Hey, So back to the night watchman, and I like the idea of they traded it around, but it was a way for the community to keep itself safe. A small community keep themselves safe, and it was a good idea. But even then, it was interesting that you went to, they could be corrupted by, hey, come over here and watch over here and not over there. I thought that was interesting. So even then, virtue was a critical component for any kind of safety inspector or police officer, whatever. Jim.
I have 3 or 4 thoughts of
That's
of
unusual.
mixed. I was going to sort of personally, all of my interactions with the police up until the one I'm going to tell you about have been in the context of me knowing I did something wrong as soon as the cop pulled me over.
Right. Saw the lights and dadgummit right there.
So I did something wrong, and I just hope it goes well from this point on. You get the ticket and then take the insurance course, the whatever. Until a couple of years ago, we were coming home from home church about 11 o'clock at night out of a Round Rock neighborhood. And we were, I forget, Deepwood, I think it was. And we came up to, Martha and I were driving, came up to McNeil. There's a red light there. And I pulled to a stop, planning to do the right on red because it's 11 o'clock at night, nobody's around. As soon as I completed my right on red, there was a policeman right behind me pulling me over. And he came to the window and said, a couple of things, said, "Do you know what you did wrong?" And I said, "No, I have no idea what I did wrong." And there were 2 policemen, and one of them was standing behind the car with his flashlight, and then the other guy was talking to me in the window. So he then asked, saw my driver's license. What did he ask, Martha? If I was old or something, I can't remember. But he then told me that I had come to a stop beyond the white stripe that you're supposed to stop behind, and that by pulling to a stop on the far side of the white line, I potentially confused drivers coming up and down the street as to whether or not I was going to stop at all. And he just wanted to warn me about how bad that behavior was. And so that is so small compared to what happens to Black people. I almost hesitate to mention it. But I think for one of the first times in my life, I thought, what's going on here? I will tell you, I immediately bought a dash cam and put it in my car and started recording everything I did, because I never wanted to have an interaction with a policeman again where it was my word against his. I mean, the guy, I figured later he was an experienced cop and he had a trainee with him, and he was showing the trainee how to stop an old man. But there was that sense, and that's a very small thing, but I think I sort of identified with, wow, this feels just wrong, to be stopped for nothing, in that sense. So thought number one. The rest of them go faster. Secondly,
that was pretty entertaining, Jim, I have to admit.
What?
That was pretty entertaining.
Until I read this article, I had never thought of those scriptures implying that there could be something wrong with government or police or somebody else. I just thought, well, you always give the benefit of the doubt to the government, and God put them there, and you just got to, you just kind of need to, grit your teeth and bear up for the things you don't like, because this is what God wants. So this was really interesting to me because I don't know, I just never read it from that perspective. Thirdly, there's a companion article. This article in Reader's Digest, when you get to the end, it said there's a companion article, click here, and there's another one in Reader's Digest written by another guy who has a little quote at the beginning. He says that he was out, I don't know, fishing or something with a retired Scottish policeman, and they had this conversation. Did you read this article, by the way, Gino?
I did not. I had to go very carefully for the one I'm talking about. I didn't have time to read the other.
Well,
and it's in Christianity Today, not Reader's Digest.
Yes, it's in Christianity Today, yeah. And it's so it's there. If you're online, you click and you're in this other article. A couple of interesting things. The Scottish retired policeman said, there's something I don't get about you Americans. Why do all your policemen carry guns? He said, you can't ever build relationship and trust in the community carrying a gun. I'm paraphrasing. But you know, we watch a lot of English mysteries, and you know, the hero's always going off doing something stupid without a gun and getting hit over the head, you know, for the plot. And almost every time I turned to Martha and said, I would never do that without a gun. If you're going to go off somewhere, well, anyway. But this guy asking the question in the article, it was interesting. I got to thinking, you know, what in our country, you know, our Western frontier kind of mindset or whatever, you know, we really prize our Second Amendment and our guns and all this kind of stuff. And there's an awful lot of countries where the authorities don't have weapons on them. And generally speaking, the society respects them enough, at least according to the TV shows we watch. You know, when the English policeman detective goes to arrest some guy, the guy, you know, he may try to run away, but he doesn't pull out a gun and shoot you. I mean, he gets arrested, you know. Does that make sense what I'm saying? That may all be false and fiction, but it occurred to me that in our culture, the respect, is it true that the respect I have for a policeman is somehow based on the fact that he has a gun and I don't? Does it make sense? I mean, and whereas it seems like in a somewhat better world, maybe England or Scotland, the respect that people have for authorities is not based upon their superior firepower. It's, you know, it's based on something else. And it seems to kind of work because as far as I know, those people still don't have to carry weapons around with them for the most part. Now, I know they have guys with guns, but yeah, I just thought that was an interesting vision.
So I want to call on Joe Hootman to respond. Thank you very much, Jim Davis. But I know that Joe Hootman's been sitting there thinking a long time. Okay, Joe.
Well, man, yeah, there's so many interesting thoughts. Well, I can guess in smaller communities too, there's the likelihood you probably know the officer doing the arresting too. But I was also grouping with you, Jim, too, that like when you getting pulled over, you get this flood of like all your interactions with authority figures from your parents and teachers on up kind of come back, and it is a little more startling. And it does seem like, so it does seem like God's ordained the state, and he's ordained the state to use force. And I guess it's a question of how one exercises that force. One clearly can exercise it from relationship and authority as more of like the watchman, the good watchman character Bill talks about. There are times also where one has to exercise that force like a shepherd, you know, concerned about the wolf. And I think as long as there's sin in the world, there'll always be need for some sort of external authority to maintain this God-ordained entity called the state in whatever form or shape that takes. But yeah, lots of interesting, and it's interesting too, Jim, thinking about like putting yourself in that personal position, and like Gino wrapped up the article with, he doesn't want his sons, his kids to live in that same kind of fear all of the time. And I don't think I really understood that very well, probably prior to recent events that are, you know, the plausible. I know that like Robert Smith, who's like the wealthiest man in Austin, you know, has to afford extra time driving to the airport because he's got black skin, and police see him in the fancy car and usually pull him over. But I thought that was a pretty rare event, but I never understood, I guess, the proximity of the threat to one's own experience fully until recent events.
Joe, thanks for being on the spot for me.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought
So many interesting things.
Yeah, I thought Jerry did a good job initially bringing the question, should they exist? And and Jerry didn't mention sin, but that's basically what Jerry was, one of the things he was talking about. Should they exist? And the answer is probably, because otherwise we're out there policing people ourselves, right? You steal my goat, I'm going to get you, and I'm going to get my goat back. When it's probably better to have a neutral third party who can adjudicate that issue without losing his temper, right?
Mhm.
That's kind of what Jerry said. Now I'm going to call on Lynette and say, Lynette, I'm just going to assume you're not carrying a gun with you everywhere you go. So what do you think about this bit that Jim Davis brought up about English and Scottish police officers not carrying a gun, and it actually building better community affairs or relationships? He said, I don't see how you could build a relationship with somebody if you carry a gun. In other words, the gun is a threat. Do you feel, I know you live with a man who carries a gun. Oh, no, we can edit that out, Jerry. So I don't think you're afraid of people with guns, but what do you think about police officers with weapons? And is there really a need for that? So that's 40, is that 45 minutes?
Yes, that's our 45-minute warning.
We're actually a little bit beyond that. We think about this question about policing in the United States. Are we prone to violence? And Jim didn't say it like this. Are we more prone to violence because we have a gun culture in our nation, and our police are part of the gun culture? Should we begin to pull back from that precipice maybe, and be a little more disarmed? And that's not a question you can say, Gino, I don't really know or care about that question. Mm-hmm. And you can raise another question.
Well, my experience, Jim's talked about watching it on TV. My experience is having read fiction again, but that I think it's reasonably well-researched fiction, but that does make a point of the fact that they don't carry a gun. And while they might have a club, a nightstick or something like that, but the involvement in the community, I think, is there and important. With the whole thing with regards to the carrying a gun, obviously Jerry feels real strongly about it and decided to go and get his permit stuff. I went through the class with him. I've gone to the shooting range once. I have no desire to ever go again. I don't have any desire to pick it up. If he asked me to bring that with him, honestly, it kind of makes me nervous if I have to transport it someplace. It's not something that I personally would be comfortable doing at all. And so, I think in general, I tend to want to take a more, can we talk through this kind of position with any kind of issue, whether that's realistic in our culture or not, especially in Texas. I don't know, but I would rather, people, like when Jim said, I had no idea why, to just be able to say, can you please explain this to me? And I don't know if y'all saw the video that Brett did about his experience when he had he had bought a new gun and had actually just picked it up to look at it when he was stopped at an intersection, and somebody reported him and that he was being threatening with it, and he got arrested and all sorts of hoopla.
Felony
so,
right.
How do we fix it? I don't know. But it seemed, that overreaction, I think, does happen. But I do have, I have some of my high school classmates, black men, who say, doctors and lawyers who are like, I get pulled over for nothing. So.
Okay, let me ask you a little more philosophical question. Then I'm gonna go to Tommy with a question. Do you think this is really just going to be how you feel about things. Do you think our country is over policed? I mean, that's been some of the accusations. I know. I assume you know what I mean by that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I honestly don't know whether I think it's over policed, but maybe the question of how it's done, whether it can be done with less violence. I understand the whole idea of taking the control of a situation, but I personally have not been in very many situations where I've needed to take physical control of something. It's been, again, talking through things. So, I really don't know.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. One more. Let me ask you one more question. Is there such a thing as Christian policing? Do you think?
I'm sorry. Repeat the question.
So it wasn't loud enough. I'm sorry. Is there such a thing as Christian policing?
I would think so. I think somebody who is a follower of Christ, who is a police officer, hopefully is going to do it the right way.
Do it well. Okay. Thanks. No, I'll leave you alone. I know I was picking on you there. So Tommy Mack, I was asking her that because that's where I was coming around to talk to you. Talk to me philosophically about how Christians should think about policing in the United States. Are there any? My assumption is that you've had a lot of time to reflect on this, and you may not feel like you're able to articulate it well in the moment or on the spot. But let me just lay my cards on the table just a little bit. I for sure think that police are needed in a world where sin is rampant, and the world is not. The world is dangerous, so I think we need police for sure. But I think the police officer has the power to be judge, jury, and executioner with that gun on his hip.
Yeah.
And so, let me ask you correctly. Where or how should our grasp of the gospel of Jesus enter into the mix of policing a secular society? So I for sure think, in fact, most of the officers I ever rode with at APD were Christians, at least nominally. Some of them that were clear followers of Christ, but almost all of them were nominal in their belief in God and the Bible. And so they were coming at it with their own religious perspective. And so what I'm asking you on a broader scale and philosophically, as a society, should we have a theology of law enforcement or a theology of policing? And if so, what would you recommend? What would you commend to us, oh, Mr. Professional?
Well, let me answer that by saying this on another.
Sure.
I was thinking about that. I really was thinking about this. This has been very enlightful. I appreciate it. So I'm not let me clarify. I'm not representing Travis County Sheriff's Department. Okay, the words that I'm about to say are Tommy McIntosh, a layman, whatever. Okay. But I heard this the other night from a protester who meant it in a derogatory way, but yet at the same time, I think there's a lot of value in it. In that, I think that we're at the point where we need to find out what is the definition of policing. Because to a certain point, all that we've mentioned our experience with police officer kind of being the jack of all trade, intervening and that kind of thing, have become, I like what the the article was talking about. In some cases, it's really hard to differentiate, are you a policeman or are you a soldier?
Ah, okay.
And a lot of that has come about because of, seriously, commercialization of, well, we've got bigger guns, we've got this kind of stuff, and you're going to need it because you've got the drug force and you're going to do all of that. So causing police department to fear, this is my take, that the drug lords are going to come in and take over Austin has caused, I think, policemen and those in authority of leadership to miss what is 80% of policing.
Very good. Yeah, I agree.
And the most dangerous situation for a police officer is a domestic call. Mm-hmm. Any cop will tell you a domestic call because he's coming to rescue the woman, and in 5 minutes it's turned around and she's after the cop because he is arresting her husband. So I think what the Christian community can do is advocate for us to say, these are needs within a community that police can help us with. And that, yeah, we need to be ready for the big guys coming in with the cannons, but the trouble is not the warlocks. The trouble is knowing how to handle mental health people. The trouble is knowing how to handle young Black teenagers, that kind of thing. And so, we've got the weapons, but we don't have the communication skills. That's it. I mean, we're ready for war, but we got to get back to daily policing, kind of thing. That's my take.
Thanks. Bill, are you raising your hand?
Yeah, I think we would all like for our policemen to be Andy Taylor, who can solve anything just by getting everybody to see everybody else's perspective. But I think our society at this point, because there's a lack of value of human life, and there's a lot of violent people out there, that our society is beyond that. Andy Taylor's not appropriate for what he would face, in our society. He'd have to be something else. We need Captain America now. We don't, Andy Taylor's, we'd like to say Andy Taylor would be our preference, but he's not adequate for what we're asking him to do,
Yeah, so you're referencing the show with Mayberry.
Yeah, right.
Jim.
Martha and I are currently reading a book that just came out by John Meacham about the life of John Lewis, the congressman from Georgia. It's called His Truth Goes Marching On. Is that it? His Truth is Marching On. His Truth is Marching On. It's the name of the book. And it's very eye-opening, kind of getting to look at the 60s again from a different perspective. But it's interesting to see, these Christians, John Lewis, Martin Luther King, this kind of what we were just talking about. They're looking at a situation in which it's an uphill battle for them. For some reason, when we were talking a while ago, I was thinking we seem to be positing that it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And we are moving down the line of we need to have bigger weapons in the hands of the good guys or something like that. Weapons, either guns or maybe psychology or training or something, I don't know. But these guys, John Lewis and these guys said, we very likely will get killed. There's a poignant place in the book where someone says to this group of potential protesters, do you realize you could get killed? And it's the lady who's in charge of them says, yes, we all drew up our last night. We signed our wills last night because we know that we could get killed because we're going to go protest and we're not going to be violent. And so I don't know where I'm going with all that, except that, maybe as Christians, and you know, if we're saying that our society is going in an escalating direction and we don't want that to happen, then maybe the price we have to pay for it is not more money and more weapons or more force, or, you know, something different. Like, what would Jesus suggest that we do in light of this problem that's escalating?
One of the eye-opening, I don't think anybody wants to answer your question. If somebody does, you speak up. One of the things that for me was eye-opening in terms of thinking about law enforcement was the shootout downtown Austin. Shootout is probably way too strong of a term, but the situation where the guy turned north on Congress Avenue and ran into a protester, and protester made a motion, and he was the trained Army guy, and he shot the protester, killed him. Anyway, but there were other people that drew their weapons and fired as well. At least one other, maybe as many as two others. So there were maybe as many as 4 weapons were discharged in one setting in downtown Austin on a recent Saturday night. And so that's why I call it a shootout. But that made me think, would I want to be a police officer in a setting where people are carrying not just a pistol hidden in their belt, but rifles? These are long guns openly on the streets. And of course, our legislature said that's okay. And it seems to me that we have, as a culture, backed ourselves into a corner where we've weaponized everything. We can't. And so maybe as a church, we need to think about, like where Jim started at least. Is there some other way, something else we can do to encourage people to settle their differences with understanding and words, and instead of going to the nuclear option and shooting each other? If we don't head in that direction, this is my opinion, I'm deeply concerned with the animosities in our society, that we're headed for some really bad times. And it looks like that's being played out in places like Portland. I'm not sure any place in the United States is quite like Portland today. Austin is not, by the way. Austin is not there.
So, if you think back 100 years in the Wild West, everybody carried a gun. And people were polite to each other, because if you weren't, you could get shot. And so, my understanding of that, it was due to the fact that, the marshal had a regional job. There weren't there, and so he didn't come around, but every so often. And so everybody essentially was their own police force. And I think I see what you're alluding to is I think we're seeing a return in some areas of this country to that kind of Wild West, in that, the mayor has said, okay, well, leave them alone. The police don't go in there. Let them do what they want. And it started out, I don't think it started out armed, but the next night you got a few people show up. The night after that, more people show up, until the next thing you know, you got a lot of guns sitting around there, and a lot of guns held by people whose brains aren't fully mature yet. And it's one of the things I think that I value in a law enforcement officer or in any authority is the ability to discern well. And actually, after Jim told his story, I was thinking, I've got a couple of stories, interactions with the law, where it's interesting to get the interaction from their point of view. There was one time I was driving on 35, and I needed to get off on an exit. and the right-hand lane was just packed full of cars. But up about a quarter mile ahead of me, there was a wide open spot up right next to where the exit was. And I'm driving a muscle car. And so I actually made a conscious decision. I said, you know, it's actually safer for me to go up there to that open spot and not force anybody to have to react to me as I merge. So I put the pedal down and I got up there real quick. Turns out I was directly next to an unmarked police car when I did that. And so I get on the flyover, I go around, and the next thing I know, I've got lights in my rearview mirror, and the guy does a felony stop. You know, he parks his car at an angle to put the engine block between me and him, and there's another cop coming across the median to support him, and he comes up and he asks me what I was doing, and I explained to him that I had, you know, decided that I would go up there to where I wouldn't be trying to force my way into traffic to make my merge. And he says, that makes sense. But my reaction when I saw you take off with it like that, it looked like you made me for a cop and were fleeing.
Oh, yeah.
And so he did a felony stop and called for backup because that was his read of the situation. And I can easily see that how he read it that way, even though I did not intend any of that. And yet we're asking our law enforcement to make these kind of split-second judgments in their job to protect life and to protect the rule of law. And so another story I have is I was training one of my kids, driver ed, and if you recall back then, we had this big blue 15-passenger van. And I was doing some night driving. I want my boys to be able to know what it's like to drive at night. And he's a young driver, so he's driving very slow. So what the neighborhood saw was this big, dark van driving about 10 to 15 miles an hour through the neighborhood. And so then they called the cops because this is suspicious, right? If I saw something like that, I might be suspicious. And so, of course, you know, the cop, you know, they give him the license plate. And as soon as the guy said, as soon as he ran my plate, he says, I know that guy. But of course, he's obligated, he has to respond to the call. And so he comes to my house just as Justin was parking the car. And he came up and I was not afraid because I've worked with law enforcement and my skin color is white. And so we had a nice conversation, and he's like, I knew before I even responded that this was not going to be a call. And if they'd left me a callback number, I'd have called the person back and said, this is not a problem. He lives in your neighborhood, you know. But again, it was a case where I'm doing one thing, I'm doing nighttime driver ed, but the other perspective is, you know, dark tinted big van driving slowly through the neighborhood. And again, I think that these, we're placing a lot of responsibility on people who are afraid and carrying weapons. And it's just, that is a hard situation. Now I'm with you, Gino. I think that policing is necessary, but it seems like there's gotta be a better way to do it.
So,
and I think a lot of it has to do with right now, I get the feeling, at least from the cops show and all of the stuff you see on TV, that there's not much respect for authority, right, which just makes their job harder. They can't, you know, we Jim talked about, you know, the London Bobby not needing a weapon because he's got respect. It was interesting as when he mentioned that our cops have guns, but a lot of other countries don't. But I can't think of any country's airport that I've flown through where I didn't see rifles very obvious, except for American airports. I don't see them there. But you go overseas, even in London, and you've got rifles.
So, Jerry, I just want to let you know that the Austin ABI is well stocked with rifles.
They're
and
just not in
semi-automatic weapons and places where the police officers are sitting behind armored panels. It's interesting. I've had that.
Right.
I was a chaplain with the APD at the airport for a long time, for a couple of years. Anyway, I'm just sort of messing with you. I think there is something we haven't talked about yet that we probably should at least talk about philosophically, and that is that our police officers are they are representatives of the state, and I don't mean the state of Texas. They're representative in Austin of the city council. And maybe there is something that we need to talk about holding our city leaders accountable for how they support or don't support the police situation or policies. The way it works in Austin, as you know this, city council hires a city manager, and the city manager hires the police chief who oversees the police department. So the police, all those guys are hired except for the city council, but we elect city council members. My hope, my dear hope is that in the next election, there are some people running who have something to say about policing in our community, and so that's really disturbing too. So I'm not sure I have a question so much as an idea maybe that we should talk about. Can we is that workable? I mean, is that even workable? Because the police chief is 1-2 people removed from the elected officials, and there's no real holding the police chief accountable. Not really. There's just putting pressure on the city council. And honestly, for the record, I have known the last 3 police chiefs, all been, in my opinion, very fine men, and all reasonably good Christians. I mean, seriously, all good guys. So I'm not saying we should fire the police chiefs. I'm saying that I think our council is a pretty messed up way. It's pretty messed up because their setting of policies and directions and what they want out of police is sending all kinds of mixed messages. Anyway, so that's, to me, it's very troubling, and particularly this our defund the police thing here in Austin, which I think is the height of foolishness. Tom, did you have your hand up, or you just scratching?
Yeah, no. I just wanted to say a lot of people don't realize there's 2 things, and then I'll hush, that a good police department and good sheriff's department must have a good check and balance system. In other words, outside agencies reviewing the case, reviewing the situation. And one of the things that has complicated this, we've got people who know nothing about law enforcement making judgments on police officers and the scene and all these things, and don't even have all the evidence, and are simply doing it out of a almost as if they're watching TV. And for an example, the sheriff's department, anytime that there is a line of duty death, we have 3 outside agencies, 3 agencies that come in to do the investigation. We don't do our own investigation of our troops. And we can call for these agency of any officer in question and that kind of thing. So we have these individuals coming in who have knowledge of the field and of the subject, but don't have any ties to that agency. And a lot of times the public doesn't know that. So one of the things that has irritated me is that you've got people who become judge and jury that know nothing about what actually took place. And that's disturbing. That causes a lot of conflict, I believe, and unfairness to the police officer or deputy, because they're found guilty before they even it's even trialed and even examined. The second thing, I think, for the church, I know we have some police officers with us. I think we need to give them a lot of support, because one of the things I hear from our Christian deputies is that they may not. It's kind of like, don't judge the servant. I learned this, Jerry, many years ago with the medical crew. Don't judge the ER crew, how they are responding after a trauma in the ER. That's just their way to cope. And so I think that the same thing with police officers who are Christians. A lot of time they don't feel supported by other Christians because you're not acting according to whatever, our rules, our guidelines. You've got your dams and your cussing going on, that kind of thing, and shame on you, that kind of thing. And so I think it really is uplifting when churches support them, and we need to keep that in mind. We're getting ready to launch. It's because of the incident that took place, not incident, but just the open emotional thing that Courtney Daniel did a few months ago, and just pleading how she was. Somebody mentioned about the organization Shield a Badge with Prayer, and I'm launching that with our sheriff's department this next week, where we get Christians to pray for our officers that are willing to be prayed for on a daily basis. So we're excited about that. So it's a way we can say the Christian community cares for you. So anyhow, that's it.
Yeah. Thank you, Tommy. Be sure you include Hope Chapel in that.
Be sure I what?
Be sure you include Hope Chapel in that.
Yeah.
We're running out of time. I don't want to continue to raise questions nobody cares about. So what do you guys want to talk about here in 5 minutes?
I liked what Jerry said about back when everybody used to have a gun, everybody was polite. But I think there were two important differences in society back then. And one is there was greater respect for authorities. And two, there was a greater respect for human life. And nowadays, people spend hours and hours playing video games and shooting up, and you get shot up and killed, and you push reset and go again, and so getting killed is just not a big deal, because, you've died 300 times. And so, and then the lack of respect for officers and lack of respect for authority, those things are integral parts of what we face today, and why I wouldn't want one of my kids to be a police officer. It's just an impossible situation to be in.
Sure. All right. So how do authority figures build respect? How do we regain respect? I've heard that 2 or 3 times. I thought, well, let's turn that and talk about it. One answer for me would be to show themselves in servant roles. I mean, every time a police officer saves somebody's life, that person is a friend of police for the rest of their life. So that's a simple way. Are there other ways to build respect? How do you gain respect with your kids? Everybody here has children.
Well, that's part of what I was thinking about, is that I try very hard when I make a mistake to acknowledge it up front, to, say, hey, I blew it, or, what I did was wrong. I'm sorry, I lost my temper. I shouldn't have done that. Part of what I think happens too is, with our kids, we're in relationship with them, and they're seeing it all along. So often, with law enforcement, it might be a virtual stranger that you're dealing with. Now, with us living in a smaller town, and especially because Jerry's been involved with people, I think maybe there's a little bit more of that community camaraderie kind of thing. I know somebody, because various first responders come to dinners at the firehouse. We might have at least seen each other across the room. Go, oh yeah, so how to make that happen on a broader scale? I don't know. Bringing police officers into the schools, perhaps. I know that happens to some degree, but I don't know how much.
Yeah.
And
I think one of the important things is you have respect for somebody who shows integrity carrying the same values that you value. And so part of our problem, I think, right now is the fact that we have so many conflicting value systems. The Christian value system is not the norm anymore in this country. And so therefore, you talked about Christian policing. And so they're going to do, the scripture that you started with was that the government should be doing what is right. And that's based on the value system that you understand. And when you have differing value systems, you may be doing what's right in your eyes, or what's right based on your culture or your belief or your theology, but somebody else will from their value system will say you're doing wrong.
Okay, but I think a reasonable answer, a reasonable thing to say in light of diversity of culture, diversity of background, is that we have a law that's interpreted by experts like Jim and executed by police officers who are trained. And that's our system, that's the current system. And everybody is subject to the same laws, hopefully fairly applied. But I do think it makes maybe more difficult because of different cultures and different viewpoints. We've said it several times, a lack of respect for authority, I think, plays a big role. And so as I think of it, I think, well, how do we build respect? Lynette hit on some things. I think Brian Manley is particularly good at apologizing. I don't know if y'all have noticed that, our Austin police chief. And I think he's taken the high road many, many times in what more difficult time to be the chief of police in Austin, Texas. So I think he is an amazing cat. Okay, Jim, you leaned forward like you had something to say. Are you just leaning forward? Okay. Yeah, you can talk all you want with that thing muted.
No, I guess the final thought that occurs to me is, it's pretty easy as a white guy and a pro-police guy and a guy who doesn't have to suffer really too many problems like that to forget, and the articles bring this back to us is, there are people who don't have that experience. In the book we were talking about, the civil rights guys, the last thing they wanted to do was get arrested. Just as they tell their stories, being arrested was like a death sentence. I mean, that's kind of how they view it, because better to be out in the street where you can run for it than to be locked up where, you may get your head caved in, kind of a thing. So I say that to say that respect building is a two-way street, and it's a difficult role. I would say I agree that we need to respect law enforcement a lot more than we do, and I just sort of acknowledge that there's a problem. There's a lot of black people driving around who have at least historical reasons to be afraid, and to kind of suggest to suggest to a black person, like, you need to work on your ability to respect the police. That's a tough mountain for some of those people to climb.
So you're suggesting also that police could work on their respect of the people they're policing?
Well, it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's not an easy
Martha Tucker.
to solve this because the natural sinful state of things seems to be that we're all going to escalate.
Yeah.
And we're all going to tend towards distrust as opposed to trust,
Pretty
because
quick.
trust is painful.
So the respect is Jim Davis formerly said respect is a two-way street.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. And so I have limited experience with Austin Police Department, but probably more than most. And all I can say is that every officer I rode with, every officer, probably 120 to 150 ride-outs, I thought they all had, they walked in a really appropriate respect for the people they were stopping. I came away from my 17 years with the police APD chaplain deal with a deep and abiding respect for these young men and women that are patrolling the street. I mean, I can't say any better than that. I think they're high quality people doing a hard job. And,
Yeah, that's been my experience of being respected. I guess what I was sort of thinking is, if you're say one of these young black men that we're talking about in these articles, they've already been told to be afraid when a policeman stops them, and so, there's expectations on both sides of that transaction, and I'm not sure what the solution is, but I'm not saying policemen aren't respectful, but I just wonder if most policemen say, I'm about to deal with a guy who thinks I might kill him. I mean, it makes a difference.
he's going to have different reaction. He's going to have different reaction than Lynette Latham.
He's about to deal with a guy who thinks, and he thinks that guy might kill him.
Yeah, both of them think they might get killed on that traffic stop.
Yeah.
It's
tough. All right, dearly beloved, we're going to call it quits at that point. And again, I thank you for joining us. And we'll see you next week at 6:30. I'll try to have an even more scintillating topic for us. So if you have something you want to talk about next week, I need to know about it. And then Virginia Cumberbatch is the week after that. And we'll be talking a little bit about systemic racism and how to talk about that. Something that may be not even true. So I'm just going to leave it there. See you, Martha.
Bye-bye, Gina. Bye, everybody.
Bye, Martha.